Pressure canning is a great, quick and easy way to preserve food, and you can use these meals in 5 minutes later on throughout the year. Pressure canning can be intimidating. I'm sure you've heard the stories of lids popping off and exploding in kitchens. I'm here to show you some quick tips on how to be safe with your pressure canning and make it much less intimidating. We'll go over all the basics that you need to start pressure canning safely and confidently. So first, let's start with what tools you need to start pressure canning. It really doesn't require a lot of extra equipment. The biggest thing that I use is obviously a pressure canner. Pressure canners are their own thing. You cannot pressure can in an Instant Pot, although I get that question a lot. You do have to invest in a good solid pressure canner. I recommend the Presto canner. I've had it for over 10 years. It's never let me down. You can change out the seal, the weight, and even if this temperature gauge starts to become off or unstable, you can unscrew it and replace it with a new one. Pressure canners typically come with a rack inside, and you can order a second one if you have this size so that you can stack jars. So this second rack would go right here, and I could pressure can 2 levels of pint jars. That's a total of 16 jars for one bag. Quarts, however, cannot be stacked in this size, and you can pressure can a maximum of 7 quarts. There's 2 different styles of pressure canner. One is more of an old-fashioned style, and that is a dial weighted gauge pressure canner. This one I have here just has one standard weight, and you adjust the heat to determine the weighted pressure. You've all probably heard those stories about pressure cannons exploding, and that is an older style pressure canner. And yes, those did happen, and I've seen those crazy photos. However, that has never happened to me, and that's because in my pressure canner, there's a built-in safety system. When the pressure canner comes to pressure, this button back here will pop up and steam will come out. That's when you apply the weight, and then you'll watch as this gauge goes up to 10 pounds, 15 pounds. If it starts to build too much pressure, around 15 pounds, you'll start to hear the pressure canner kind of rock on the stove. I can hear that noise from a mile away, but typically I never leave my kitchen. It's a very clear noise. It's kind of like when a mom hears a baby crying, and you immediately go to the stove and either shut off your temperature or decrease the flame. The next thing that will happen if it goes ignored or you leave the room is this safety will pop and release pressure. Unfortunately, if that were to ever happen, your pressure canner lid would be considered unsafe for further canning and you'd have to replace it. So try not to let it get to that point. But the safety was put in place to save your kitchen so that it will not ever explode in theory. Next, let's talk about jars. Not all jars were created equal, and that is definitely true for pressure canning. I highly recommend an on-brand jar using Ball or Mason or Care jars that are newer. When you're pressure canning, do not use jars that you found at a garage sale or in your grandmother's basement because you don't know how old that glass is, and over time glass breaks down. What can happen is that the jars can be filled with these fresh, yummy food, and then when you go to pressure can them, they explode under the pressure. So definitely find a brand name jar. If you're looking for where you can source jars because they're sold out in your area, we'll post links in the description below. Here I have a pint jar and a quart jar. These are the only 2 sizes that you can safely pressure can. Any jam jars are too small for the pressure, and anything larger than a quart won't heat evenly and the food in the middle could spoil. You also want to make sure your jars are sanitized and that your lids and rings are also clean and brand new. You never want to reuse your lids with pressure canning, but sometimes you'll hear of people doing it with water bath canning, and typically you can get away with it if they've been sanitized properly. It's simply because when you're bringing the jars up to pressure, you really want to make sure you have a proper seal. That's why I always use brand new. Next, let's talk about kitchen gadgets. You may possibly have all of these already in your kitchen, but just in case, these are good things to have on hand when you start your canning journey. One of them is a strainer to siphon out any bits of debris in your broth or things that you want to hold back from the jar. This one works great and fits into the canning funnel, just like this. Canning funnels can come in plastic, or my favorite are metal, but the metal ones are getting harder to find. You want to make sure you have a couple of these on hand, especially if you're doing multiple projects, because they're very easy to get lost in the dishes. Jar grabbers are great. Shout out to Megan, who just got me this one. I have actually started my canning journey and never used a jar grabber until 10 years later. So they're not super necessary. In their place, I use tongs or just my hands. because I worked in a coffee shop for a long time. But jar grabbers are great if you don't want to burn yourself. Next, I love these silicone grabbies. This helps with moving the pressure canner around or even just moving jars from side to side of the canner as you're loading it. And the last thing is just a butter knife. It's important to get the air out of the jars, so you place the butter knife into the jar as you're filling it to make sure all of the food that you packed in has settled. If you're looking for all these tools, we'll put links in the description below. Another great thing to have around during preservation season is lots of vinegar. I splash vinegar in my water for my water baths or pressure canning for every batch because it demineralizes the water so that you don't have this yucky film on your jars, especially if you have hard water like me that comes from a spring. Fresh produce is super important in canning. If you are using fresh, just picked produce, your product is gonna taste that much better after it's been canned. I love growing peppers. And speaking of growing things, if you're getting into canning, it's great to support your local farmers. You can find things in bulk at farmers markets, but if you don't have local farmers markets and you have the space or the desire, I highly recommend growing your own produce for canning. Here I have my seed library. It's just a collection of all my favorite seeds that I enjoy growing throughout the growing season. I save seeds or I buy them from local heirloom seed companies. This is an amazing way to get a new, unique product in your jars. For example, last week I canned some stew and I used purple, yellow, red, and orange carrots. That's not something you'll typically find in a grocery store. So in order to ensure freshness in your canning and in your kitchen, I highly recommend you try to grow something. One of the best tools that you can use when you're learning to can are investing in some good canning recipe book. As you've probably heard me mention before, it's really important to follow a recipe for safety. So the #1 standard book is the Ball Complete Book of Home Preservation. Probably every home canner has this one in their house. And as you can see, I've got plenty of bookmarks to marking my favorite recipes for quick access. I even have some of the page numbers memorized. Check out zucchini relish on page 273. This one I just wanted to shout out to somebody who was local to my area that wrote a canning recipe book. I think this is such a fun book. It's called Not Your Mama's Canning Book, and it has all these unique recipes that are definitely not ones you'd find in the Ball Canning book. She incorporates fun spices like cardamom and clove into things you'd never imagine. So if you're looking to spice up your cupboard, check out this book. And lastly, if you're looking for a guideline for pressure canning, one that's very comprehensive in the science, I highly recommend this book, The Complete Guide to Pressure Canning. This shows how much weight you should use in pressure for every recipe, and it gives great tips and answers to all of your questions. When you're reading recipes for pressure canning, you'll often see that they talk about adjusting for altitude, and that's where it's important to know your altitude for your area. Here we're on the hills, so we're over 2,000 feet above sea level. You may be in a lower area, and that means that you could stay truer to the recipe weight. In this book, Complete Guide to Pressure Canning, she actually has an altitude chart. We'll list one on the screen as well. So because I'm over 2,000 feet, if my weighted gauge canner calls for it being 10, I'm actually gonna go up to 15. Water bath canning is similar to pressure canning in that you're still sealing jars. However, water bath canning is more for higher acid foods. That are things like tomato sauce, jams, jellies, and pickles. You'd never wanna water bath green beans, although there are some old recipes out there, or things like summer squash because they're just a low acid food. The difference between water bath canning and pressure canning is that pressure canning is a sealed, locked, controlled environment that builds pressure over a period of time, and it's much longer than a water bath can. Another difference is that the jars are not fully submerged in a pressure canner because you're building pressure. Where in a water bath canner, you want to make sure the water is completely covering your jars. For more information, check out our video on water bath canning below. With regards to canning meat, like I've done with the stew beef, a lot of people might wonder if you need to use fresh meat, because you've heard that you can't thaw meat and then refreeze it. However, you can absolutely can frozen meat or fresh meat. I actually prefer canning frozen meat because it's a little bit easier to work with in the canning process. As long as you follow the directions of your pressure canner using your manual or a good recipe, and make sure that the pressure canner vents for 10 minutes and then comes up to the right pressure, it's completely safe to can meat, not to mention delicious. Another question that gets asked a lot is, can you skip corners by adding hot water to the pressure canner or venting it quickly? and I highly recommend not cutting any corners when you're following a pressure canning recipe. Pressure canning definitely takes a day's commitment. I usually line up several recipes and just run my canner all day, planning to be home and not distracted too much when you have 3 kids, and so that I can pay my full attention. But that investment of a day's worth of meal prep ends up usually being about 60 to 65 quick meals for me throughout the year, so it's well worth it. It's super important to follow directions with canning, like I've probably mentioned 10 times already in this video. However, you have to get over the fear that has been completely pushed into our culture that canning is not safe. I follow 3 steps to make sure that my jars are safe and okay to eat for my family. 1, find a guinea pig. I'm just kidding. 1 is make sure that the seals are sealed properly when you pull them out of your canning cupboard. Every once in a while, I'll put a jar into my canning cupboard that was sealed and it will pop. And that just happens. Sometimes there's debris on the rim. Sometimes whatever's inside has become alive because it wasn't cooked at a proper temperature. But most likely it's a fluke thing. And if the lid has been popped, it's not safe to eat and you must dispose of it. You don't want to put it in your compost and you don't want to put it somewhere that wild animals or your own animals could consume. The next thing that I look for as I'm opening it, if the seal is perfectly sealed, is smelling it. Now, I've never had anything smell foul before, and everybody says that botulism is the silent killer and you can't smell it. However, if I'm confident that I've followed the instructions of the recipe and the jar smells good, then I'm sure that it's safe to eat for my family. The last thing I look for is the color. Has the jar maintained color, been stored out away from sunlight, and still looks the same as when I put it in the canning cupboard, then it's safe to eat. If your jars have been stored away from sunlight and their color has changed, that might be an indicator that there's something wrong with what's inside the jar. And so just to be safe, I would definitely dump those. Pressure canning is so much fun, and as I mentioned before, I kind of use it as a meal prep. So 3 things that I canned just this week alone was straight stew chunks. So it's just stew beef and a little bit of salt. And that's a versatile thing that I can use. I can strain out the stew chunks, add some mayo, and make beef sandwiches like a tuna salad, but it's a beef salad. Or I can use it for beef stroganoff or barbecue beef, which is amazing. Super simple. All you do is add your condiments and go. The next thing that I made was beef stew, and we'll link to that in the description below. We have a video on it if you're interested. And I used zucchini and carrots, which was amazing. The last thing is a family favorite. My sister-in-law and I canned cheeseburger soup. We did not include the dairy because dairy is typically not the safest to use in pressure canning, although you will find some recipes that have dairy. We canned the soup without the dairy, and when we open the jars later on to heat them up, we'll add the milk and a little bit of fresh cheddar for a delicious, quick and easy meal. So now that you have all the basics that you need to know on pressure canning, check out this video for a quick recipe on how to can beef stew.